Hello and welcome. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Shelby Magid, the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you very much for joining us today for our event titled What's Next for Ukraine's 2023 Counteroffensive. Today, I'm joined by some of our top experts to help break this widely discussed topic down. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. I will say we've got a strong in-house crew today. We're joined by Ambassador John Herbst, our Senior Director at the Eurasia Center and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Minister Andrei Zahernuk, a distinguished fellow of the Eurasia Center and a former Minister of Defense of Ukraine, and Deborah Kagan, Senior Advisor at the Eurasia Center and a former Senior State and Defense Department official. So we're going to start off with our panelists and then move to audience questions. If you have a question at any time, please visit askac.org and I can pitch them to our panel. Again, that is askac.org to submit your questions. Now we'll get started. Minister Zahernuk, I'll go to you. Can you please provide a description of the current state of the counteroffensive, both in the south, including developments today, as well as beyond Robotyne and towards Tokmak, and in the north around Bakhmut?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for invitation to this event. The counteroffensive is ongoing and it's progressing. So the main line of effort is, of course, to the south from Zaporizhia. That is the direction which we call the Tokmak direction. That's where the village of Robotyne is, and there's a substantial progress there. But of course, it's an extremely difficult effort, and the pace is quite slow. But nevertheless, it's happening. On the as the Russians are expecting us to get to the Tokmak. So they are improving their defenses. They are, according to the latest reports, are building the new lines of defense. They are improving the defenses of Tokmak itself, bringing additional forces there, and so on. So generally speaking, there is quite a substantial effort from their side to stop us on that direction, and there is obviously a substantial effort from the from Ukrainian forces to make sure that we capture Tokmak. However, of course, it goes very difficult, but nevertheless, the initiative is clearly with the Ukrainian forces. There's another line of efforts which we call the Berdyansk direction, and there is a movement there towards the villages Novomayorsk and Priutne. There is a certain some progress over the last few days in the Bakhmut direction, in the area surrounding the Bakhmut, and in the Avdiivka direction, the Ukrainian forces also advanced toward the settlement called Spartak. So generally speaking, if to make a summary of the last couple of days, we can see that the progress is ongoing. It goes very difficult. It meets a very substantial resistance from the Russian forces. They are trying to keep their lines of defense. They understand that the main line of defense on the Zaporizhia was broken, so they are trying to build the other one. And obviously, as you probably know from the press, there's an immense amount of the fortifications and the mines, and there's quite a limited resources which Ukraine has in order to go through the minefields. Generally speaking, I have to say that by speaking to many of my friends which are currently there, I can say that there seems to be like a lack of generally a technical solution to this problem. So the quantity of mines is so high that normal equipment which been built either in the Western countries or in Ukraine, which been provided for military demining, assault demining, it works with a very limited success, because the minefields are protected with the artillery fire, which is used against the demining devices pretty much as soon as they see that. So overall, we can say that one of the lessons from this war is, and from the current status, is that we definitely need to think of the additional technical solutions to that sort of operational situation, because the current solutions are working with very limited success. But generally speaking, clearly Clearly, Russians are trying to do the counterattack in the Kupiansk direction, which is in Kharkiv region. At the moment, it's not successful, but generally, the initiative is currently in Ukrainian forces. However, with a very substantial effort.
Thank you very much for that thorough readout. Now I'll turn to you, Deborah. There have been several stories in August in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other media suggesting that U.S. and other Western officials were disappointed in the progress of Ukraine's counteroffensive. More recently, there have been stories, for example, in The Economist, suggesting Western officials believe the counteroffensive is going better and that prospects for more progress are real. What's behind these stories and how do they relate to the battlefield?
You know, there's an old expression that many military commanders who I worked with in Iraq and Afghanistan used to have, which was that Washington was very good at an assessment with their 10,000-mile screwdriver. So they'd be sitting back in Washington at their desks, telling the guys out in the field actually fighting the war what they were doing right and what they were doing wrong. And everyone in Iraq and Afghanistan, and John knows this, would just sit there and laugh at this because it was so ridiculous. The other expression is that most people who comment on this stuff are always looking through a lens of the last war that they fought in. And that war has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in Ukraine now. And so I tend to eschew those commentaries because it's mostly people who are armchair. They're sitting behind a desk someplace and they're commenting how someone's fighting and how someone's not fighting, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. And they have no idea because they're not with boots on the ground and they don't see the fight. So I think the first thing is the media, and indeed many governments, first glorified the Russian troops and said how great they were. And then when they weren't all that great, they went in the complete opposite direction to say that Russian forces are incredibly incompetent, implying that the Ukrainians could overrun them in, 3.5 days. And that's just not accurate either. And that is the sort of game that the media and some Western governments have fallen into. I think anyone who's been watching this closely knows what the minister just said, that this is very difficult. Let me just focus on the mining issue for 1 minute here. Nowhere else on the face of this planet has there ever been such mining done and such in depth over such a massive area of territory. It's never been done before. And for people to comment that somehow you can just plow through this and change it overnight is ridiculous, because the minister is right. Not only do the current technical solutions not work, but we don't have a lot on the shelf that has worked because we've never faced mining like this before, ever. And so I think there has been too hasty of a decision to sort of say this is working, this is not working, by people who have no clue of what's going on the ground.
Thank you very much. And then it looks like the administration has finally agreed that pilots can train on actual F-16s, and we're hearing whispers that ATACMS will be provided. Can you also discuss the pattern of U.S. weapons delivery to Ukraine? What's the status of these and other key weapon systems?
Well, I'm not in Ukraine. I'm not, but I will say, even watching it from back here, it's been exhausting to watch. It's been exhausting, frustrating, and outwardly just very tedious. This sort of drip, drip, drip of weapons, supplies. Well, maybe they can do this, maybe they can do that. At every turn, Ukrainian trained military personnel have shown themselves to be incredibly quick learners and incredibly quick implementers and very great innovators as well, and sort of taking equipment, changing it, making it more adaptable to the battle space. So the F-16 issue, I think, thank you for the Europeans on this, who pushed very hard on the United States to make this happen. There were, the Danes and the Dutch in particular really led this coalition and were ready to go. Training is underway. We saw Senator Kelly from Arizona last night, who was very excited about the pilots starting to train in Arizona. He spoke about this eloquently. And we know that Senator Risch from the other side of the aisle talked about ATACMS and talked about how important getting this done was and the reasons for this. So the painful part of it for Ukraine, much more than for people like myself, yourself, and John, has been the slowness with which this has moved forward. These fourth generation aircraft will make a difference. I'm tired of reading articles that saying it'll take a year for them to make a difference. That's just not the case. And I think if the administration does the right thing on this, they will make that decision on ATACMS, and they will give Ukraine enough of them to make a difference and not hold back on numbers. And in terms of training on these things, there's absolutely no fundamental difference in uploading the ATACMS, except it's really big and heavier and weighs a lot, than there is in uploading a Gimler on a HIMARS. The learning curve would be about 10 hours. So I think the sooner those decisions are made, the sooner they can flow. And despite what the press has been saying, we do have enough of them. So we should not shortchange the Ukrainians on numbers.
Excellent, thank you. Now over to you, Ambassador Herbst. Speaking of some frustrations, there are reports that UN Secretary General Guterres and President Erdogan are asking the West to ease sanctions on Russia, for example, by removing the ban on Russian Agricultural Bank from SWIFT and allowing insurance for Russian grain shipments in order to get Moscow to agree to restore the grain deal. Does this mean that Russian extortion in the Black Sea is working?
If in fact they are pushing for those concessions, it means that Putin is able to turn some foreign partners into his allies. Look, sanctions have been put on Russia, serious sanctions, relating, for example, to their shipping, relating to their insurance, because of their war of aggression against Ukraine. So after he starts this war of aggression, he decides to escalate by blocking grain shipments from Ukraine, which are vital for food supplies, especially in the global south. This creates a problem elsewhere. So Erdogan and Guterres did a good job last year in persuading Putin to restore that via a grain deal. And Ukraine was part of that grain deal. But then Putin decides that this grain deal is not working for him. It's not putting pressure on Ukraine the way he wanted. So he backs out of it. So then, if these reports are true, then Erdogan and Guterres becomes Putin's advocate, asking the West to ease sanctions to reward Putin for backing down from an additional aggressive step. If these reports are true, I keep saying that because we're not certain of that, but if they are true, that means they are encouraging Putin to commit additional provocations so he can get additional relief from steps we've taken for conducting this war full of war crimes on Ukraine. That would be very disappointing. Ultimately, it will not work. Ukraine will not agree with it. We will not agree with it. But nonetheless, it gives Putin some reason to hope, and that's a serious mistake.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister, back to you. NATO has declined to protect grain and other civilian convoys heading to and from Ukraine. No U.S. Navy ships have appeared in the Black Sea in years. Is NATO conceding the Black Sea to an aggressive Kremlin? Although the Brits reportedly have been flying air cover lately for ships in the Western Black Sea, and U.S. Congress has voted for the Black Sea Security Act, which is urging a more active U.S. and NATO policy designed to enhance security there. Do you expect to see a stronger U.S. and NATO presence in the Black Sea, and what would the implications be for that?
Thank you. Well, we would love to see a more presence in NATO in the Black Sea, but so far we don't see indications that this presence will be actually effective in resolving the current crisis, because obviously Russians are understanding that NATO ships and NATO forces are not willing to get into direct combat with Russians. So essentially they are playing quite an aggressive role, and they are saying that essentially announcing what we call a sea denial for any ships in the zone where they attempt to pursue a military control. So essentially, they're announcing that they're happy to attack any ship in their proximity, and whoever is going to breach that blockade will be risking. I don't think that at the moment there is any political appetite in NATO countries to challenge that. Challenge that not just in a diplomatically. I think diplomatically they will be challenging that, but actually militarily. And until that happens, Russia will understand that they can do whatever they like essentially, and they would continue. So at the moment, among the analytical community in Ukraine, the position is that we simply have to follow on and the destroy Black Sea ships of Russia one by one. And essentially, that would be the only practical way for us to resolve that issue, because indeed there would be some presence of NATO ships in the Black Sea. As you know, Black Sea is covered by a so-called Montreux Convention, which was signed in 1930s. Which is in a completely different strategic environment. However, this is an international treaty, and it's active, and it assumes that the ships of the non-Black Sea countries or non-Black Sea ports even can stay in the Black Sea over a very limited period of time. It's basically a few weeks. So that was enough for NATO ships to be here for some passages or for participation in exercises. But it certainly wasn't enough to do any substantial, any sort of operational duties. So, and again, as I said, there was no desire of any of those countries to actually protect the freedom of the navigation to the extent that if Russia challenges it, they can get into the combat. So with this, I don't think that anything would be really effective, and that's why we are absolutely clearly focused on the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet. I think that we can do that. That's obviously a challenge, I mean, from technical perspective, because we can do this with asymmetric measures, such as what we've seen today in Sebastopol. But I don't believe that Russia, understanding all these diplomatic and geopolitical limitations, I don't believe that Russia will actually go for defreezing the grain corridor unless there are some significant concessions offered. And as Ambassador just mentioned, they are very dangerous on their own. So I think we'll pursue the strategy of just elimination of the Russian presence in that part of the Black Sea.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Minister, it is still early morning here in DC. So if anyone's joining and hasn't seen all the news yet, can you just catch us up? What did happen in Sevastopol today?
It still has to be confirmed by Ukrainian forces, but what it seems to be is that there's been a damage done to two ships staying in the Sebastopol harbor, in the Sebastopol maritime vessel repair facility, which was occupied in Sebastopol by Russian forces back in 2014, and is used currently as for the repairs of the ships. So one ship was a large landing assault ship for Marines. So basically, it's a large class. It's a class of the ships which are about over 10 of them in Russia, and they brought all of them from various fleets: Northern Fleet, Baltic Fleet, and then some from Black Sea Fleet, in order to assemble a flotilla and land in the northern part of the Black Sea around Odessa region. So that was their plan. And they brought it before the invasion, so in January and February 2022. However, they never managed to do that landing because of the coastal protection which Ukrainian forces arranged. But nevertheless, they're still planning, and they're still planning to use those ships in the future, and that's why they're part of the overall idea of the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet. And then there was also a diesel electrical submarine damaged as well. From what we understand, the damage is terminal. So basically, I don't think they would be repaired.
Thank you very much. Deborah, just want to add on for you with that. Do you think this attack would change Russian perceptions of their control at all?
Well, I think, as the minister said, that it's really fundamental. There are tactical gains in the battle space, and there are strategic gains. And I think getting control and slowly getting rid of the Russian fleet here would be a huge strategic gain. I mean, it fundamentally would change the course of this, and might, I don't know, I'm not terribly optimistic, might change how NATO looks at operations there. I think there's an important point here. There are two NATO countries that sit in the Black Sea. One of them, Romania, has already taken a couple of hits from Russian floating sea mines. They've destroyed one of the military vessels, and it also hit a tourist vessel a couple weeks ago because the mines are not tethered. So I think NATO needs to be much smarter, and they can't just say it's because of Ukraine, because they have two members who sit in that sea, three actually, if you include Turkey on the Montreux, and Turkey's been much more strict on Montreux implementation now than they were back in 2014. And I think that it's important to understand that, and hopefully these gains that Ukraine is making will allow NATO to understand that they have to do a better job of even doing a 3-day freedom of navigation operation in the Black Sea. So that's the first thing. I do think, like in many conflicts, when you control your airspace and you control your sea space, you win. So I think anything Ukraine can do to further dilute Russian naval superiority here would be huge. And I think if you combine that with what the F-16s can possibly give Ukraine and gaining at least some air parity, I think those become massive strategic gains, not just tactical ones.
Excellent, thank you. Just to give everyone a shot, Ambassador Herbst, anything to add on that?
Oh, look, what we've seen since the big invasion, countless times, is Ukrainian ingenuity creating embarrassing strikes for Russia, whether it was taking out the Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, whether it was their efforts on Zmini Island, whether it were commando attacks on Crimea. We've seen it time and again. And this is just one more example of it. But I think Andrei pointed at the strategic possibilities here, that these irregular operations have forced the Black Sea fleet out away from the coast of Odessa, and has put them in a defensive position. So all they can do is from the eastern Black Sea launch missiles. And the prospect of being able to remove those ships one by one is a serious prospect. And that's why the Russian media, when they were commenting on what happened today, were saying, well, this was a diversion by the Ukrainians because their quote unquote counteroffensive is stuck. Well, we know the counteroffensive is not stuck, but you also know that this is a big embarrassment for Moscow, so their propagandists have to put it in the very best light possible. And the more of these things we see, the quicker we get to a successful end of this war.
Excellent, thank you. So Deborah, taking a step back to a certain extent, the administration says and has been saying for months that it's given Ukraine everything it needs and everything it has asked for. But according to U.S. doctrine, how would the U.S. conduct a counteroffensive against fortified position and considerable minefields, as the minister told us about? What weapon systems would the U.S. rely on?
Well, first, I want to say that the way the U.S. has set up its military strategy for years has been that you wouldn't be in a position of having to do such a counteroffensive, because you would have that superiority in the first place, so that you're not dealing with that kind of an attack and at the get-go. I think everything it needs is a very subjective statement, and I think that it's correct to say that when you were training those 9 brigades in Europe and the like, that you gave them these assets and that assets, but you already had decided before that began what limitations you were going to put on this. So it's like playing a sport with one hand tied behind your back, or one foot tied behind your back. And so what this comes down to is, would the U.S. ever send anyone into combat without air superiority? Or would NATO these days? Absolutely not. In fact, I think the last time the U.S. did this to U.S. forces was in Korea, and they would never do that again after what happened in Korea, because of the sheer magnitude of Chinese and Soviet aircraft and the like. They put U.S. forces and all those forces at great harm's way and great casualties. The U.S. since then has never, ever, ever entered a battle space without massive air superiority. something that they did not believe that Ukraine either merited or needed. And that was just an incredibly incorrect assumption. And it led to needless casualties in this conflict. And that's why bringing the F-16s on board, is it going to be magic? No. But when you integrate that with long-range fighters on the ground, long-range missiles, air-launched missiles that have been provided by the French and the British, and hopefully the Germans will make a decision on Taurus soon, which would be a very, very good, actually, I think better than Scalp and Storm Shadow system. If the Germans make that decision, would be extremely positive. But what you do is, when you're looking and you're fighting in the battle space, as the minister knows well, it's an integration of all those systems. So you can't say you expect more out of the counteroffensive without air. You can't say you expect more out of the counteroffensive without long-range fires. And so if that dynamic changes, then the outcome changes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister, hearing that, what's your checklist? What do we need? What does Ukraine need to have a decisive breakthrough?
Well, the list of the equipment is not changing, and basically the overall expectations not changing. Of course, we've been all intrigued by those rumors about ATACMS rockets, because obviously they would be extremely helpful. And we've been discussing this for a while, for months and months, and we do not, frankly, understand the reasons of that kind of withholding. But if that's going to be changed, I mean, that's fantastic. Otherwise, I have to say that, to be honest, the biggest issue which we see right now is that sort of some analytical and then media movement in towards the discussion of the something which is going wrong, or something doesn't work out, or something fails, and so on and so on. So clearly, Ukrainian government did not publish a schedule of the counteroffensive. There hasn't been any specific dates and numbers and and some kind of a calendar plan. So all these discussions are, I think, is a bit too much, and I would. First of all, obviously, we don't wish anyone to get through the experiences like Ukrainian forces going through. But generally speaking, it seems like there are two different realities. One reality exists in a sort of information space where everybody is like building up some expectations and then discussing them and then talking about whether they were achieved or not. And then there is like an actual reality. Indeed, there's a lot of comments coming from very, very far from Ukraine and very, very far from the areas where everything happens. And then we also have people who came there for like a couple of days and then try to explain everything and so on. So I would probably ask that the international community, observers community, just let us do the job and don't be that negative straight away. But in general, I think that the continuation of the support of Ukraine as per communication between DoD and MOD of Ukraine, that would be great, because they enjoy, despite the changes in MOD Ukraine, they enjoy a great collaboration. And if that continues, and particularly with the addition of the F-16s and ATACMS, then that would be great.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Herbst, back to you. At the recent G20 summit in India, the statement on Russia's war on Ukraine, while calling for the observance of territorial integrity, only spoke of the war in Ukraine and did not ask Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. Russian analysts like Sergei Markov have called this a diplomatic victory for Moscow, and Ukrainians have criticized the statement as weak on Moscow. Yet, Western analysts supportive of Ukraine, including Carl Bildt, consider the statement as a victory for Ukraine in the West. What's your evaluation of the statement and what produced it?
I think the statement was not a step forward in gathering international support against Moscow's war of aggression in Ukraine. Having said that, it may be that venue and the location for the G20 were not conducive for getting a stronger statement. There are a fair number of states in the G20 who don't recognize how dangerous and how evil Moscow's war on Ukraine is. And then, of course, the host has been a de facto ally of the Kremlin going back to Soviet days. I'm speaking about India. So I suspect Modi did not want to have a statement that might embarrass his partner, Putin, and he worked towards that end. So I am not in no way sugarcoating that statement. It was not a plus. You might call it a small negative, but only a small negative because, again, given the group we're talking about, the group of 20, given the location, we probably could not have expected much more. So we just chalked this up. We've managed it, and we'll move forward. It's worth remembering that we fought a decades-long Cold War with the Soviet Union. The predecessor to the Global South, the non-aligned movement, by definition, was not involved in that fight. The West won that war, and I think Ukraine will win this war with the strong support of the West. And we will have to manage the Global South as we had to manage the non-aligned movements back in the day.
Thank you very much. Now, I want to remind our audience that if you want to submit any questions, go to askac.org, submit them there, and I'll go through and pitch them to our panelists. We've got a lot of questions coming in, but before we move to that, Deborah, Mr. Minister, anything you want to add to Ambassador Herb's last points?
I would only add that, of course, any reluctance of calling things as what they are frustrating, and they're counterproductive to the strategic security in the world. So if some people are thinking that, if they don't call a genocide, or if they don't call an aggression, that somehow makes the world a better place, and that's obviously not the case. And so every time when we see that people are reluctant to confront Russia in what they do, it just gets us back to the days when when the world was much less safe. So that's absolutely not productive. And whoever is in touch with the Global South analysts, journalists, and so on, and watching us right now, I mean, it's perhaps it would make sense to explain to them that that doesn't help them in the long run, like at all. That's probably it.
Great, thank you. Okay, we are moving to audience questions. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name. And again, askac.org is where you can submit these. Deborah, I'll pitch this one to you. From Matthias Dehan. It seems that drone warfare is now a critical part of this conflict, close coordination with ground troops. What technological help is Ukraine looking for to aid the ground troops?
Well, I'm not the person to say what Ukraine is looking for. What I will say is this. The fundamental nature of warfare is changing by the minute. We used to talk about an industrial revolution taking 150 years, 2 different industrial revolutions. Now industrial revolutions happen in 3 hours. And so I think that's worth keeping in mind when you look at this and you say, yes, this is changing how they do things. And if you look at what the Marine Corps has been saying, what the Army's been talking about, everything that they're developing, a lot of this is lessons learned from Ukraine and how you go forward with this and AI in terms of the battle space. So yes, drone warfare and cheap drone warfare. If you can put something up for $500 that can take out a $1 million piece of equipment, that's a victory in and of itself.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Do you want to add on that?
Yes, I would add that indeed we are already transitioning into a stage when it's not just like drones are helping, very helpful devices for the ground forces. They are creating completely new concepts of operations. So they're totally changing. It's not like they are adding existing concepts; they're creating new ways to fight the war. Completely. And we are in the very beginning of this process right now. So I just have to make sure that, I say that because when we were commenting the events in Sevastopol this morning, there's been some people think that these are some kind of a random acts or some kind of a random attacks, which maybe somehow happened, and they're not a part of something bigger. Well, actually, they are, because they are beginning of the trend, which we will see in very shortly, within months, and certainly in a year from now, we'll be seeing a totally different war. Because right now, this is a beginning of the asymmetric warfare using the unmanned platforms on a completely different scale. And that's why we are certain that we'll be able to make a substantial harm to the Black Sea Fleet of Russia, is because these platforms are just being developed. I mean, they're very new, and essentially what we see are like advanced prototypes. We are in a race. This doesn't mean that Russia is not doing the same. They're doing exactly the same. So they're developing new drones. They are scaling Iranian drones in Russia, and so we are in a sort of a drone race right now. And of course, we'd be interested in the help from West, particularly from the United States. It's not the help of the existing platforms, perhaps, because indeed we are on the frontline innovation here, but it could be a help with some enabling technologies. For example, a massive problem for the drones right now is electronic warfare. There are a lot of different tools and platforms which are able to make GPSs immune to the warfare. And these are tools that developed in the West. There are some communication devices, there are some geopositioning devices, and so on and so on. There are like propulsion devices. So enabling technologies which are currently existing, and of course AI, of course, like target recognition and so on. So all these are being tested right now in Ukraine, and I can tell you that the drone which hasn't passed through testing here is probably not that good. So generally speaking, yeah, we're interested in working with the companies from the free countries to help to boost that industry here.
Excellent, thank you. Got an anonymous question I'll hand to you, Ambassador Herbst. Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin just met, with Kim giving a full-throated endorsement of Putin's war in Ukraine. Reportedly, the reason for the meeting was Russia's request for North Korea to supply it weapons and ammunition. How might these developments affect the course of the war?
Well, let's start with the fact that sanctions by the West have produced a great deal of controversy, meaning that some people believe they have not been successful as intended in stemming Russia's aggression. And I think what we've seen in the arms industry is that between sanctions and export controls, we've had a very serious effect on hampering Russian efforts to maintain production of war material. That's why, well over a year ago, they were begging Iran for drones and getting them from Iran. And Russia, which is always considered to have been the big artillery nation of the world, has been running out of ammunition. And so now they've turned to the North Koreans. So obviously, if they can get supplies from North Korea, which they don't have, that's a minus for Ukraine. And it looks like that's what's happened. But people who know much more than I do about North Korea say they wonder in what sort of shape that ammunition is. It's been in storage for a long, long time. Quality control is a problem there. So it may be that they'll reach a deal and Putin will find that 25% of war is not going to be usable. You also have the problem of this very long supply line from North Korea to the front in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian forces, as we've already noted in this conversation, have been very good at irregular operations. And those supply chains may likewise draw the attention of creative Ukrainian special forces. I don't mean to underestimate the impact of this. It's real, it's important, it's unfortunate, but not a game changer. And once again, it's a sign of the weakness of the Russian war industry, which is a good thing, of course.
Thank you. Mr. Minister, anything to add?
Yes, I just wanted to add that one of the key problems of Western analysts to endorse our concept of victory is the assumption that Russian capabilities are endless, virtually endless. They have endless resources, they have endless industry, they have as much money as they want, they have as many workers and engineers and people as they want, and so on. So this is illustration that they're not endless, that they actually can lose and they can run out of weapons. Because the fact that they're going to Korea, to one of the poorest countries in the world, asking for shells, it means that they're running out and they're in a serious trouble of launching the industry. We cannot say that it's like all risks are gone. Of course not. They're trying to kind of ramp up the industry and so on. But this whole endless Russian capability is a myth. And let's remember that. Thank you.
Excellent.
There's actually one more point I'd like to add. And I think what I'm about to say, Deborah might be able to amplify. There's never been an illusion that Ukraine did not need weapons from abroad. And of course, the United States, our NATO allies, other partners have been providing this. Another source of some supply for Ukraine has been South Korea. One wonders if North Korea is getting into this game the way it is, might have any impact on South Korean calculations.
You know what? I don't think it does. I think South Korea had a recognition early on that it never sort of drew back their defense industry during what other people were calling the end of the Cold War, because of where they're located in the world and the threat they face every day. And I think that's why South Korea was able to keep producing and supply countries like Poland with what they needed on a very rapid way, much more so than US industry, for example. But I'll put one other point in here, and it's a little bit sarcastic, but the fact that Putin is depending on Iran and North Korea for the betterment of his forces, there's a great saying, the company you keep. And if that's his version of allies, and the G20 people are scared of offending Russia, I would think again, based on the company that Putin's keeping. And if you're afraid, if you're India, who indeed depended on Russian equipment, and now a lot of what India makes is quite indigenous, if you depended on Russia for that, if you're depending on Russia to sort of balance you against China and other things, I would think twice. Look at the company they're keeping and saying, is this really the guy you want to tether your future relationship to? And see what good is that going to give you? So I think the North Korea thing is excellent from the perspective, because it should tell the rest of the world that was banking on Russia that perhaps you ought to withdraw your funds from that country.
Great point. Thank you. Mr. Minister, back to you with a more technical question. This is from Hans Larson. Does Tokmak have to be fully taken, or could it be bypassed or encircled for the time being?
Can you say who? Can you clarify? Can you say again, please?
Does Tokmak have to be fully taken, or could it be bypassed or encircled for the time being?
It can be, but it's a very small town, so there's no point of like creating some kind of movement around it and so on. And yes, it is encircled by fortifications right now completely. So it's like a small fortress, but it is small, and I don't believe that there will be some sort of a plan of not addressing that eventually. But the standard doctrine assumes that the troops can be encircled in any case, so they could be part of the overall operational plan. So basically, it could be both encircling and taking it later.
Great, thank you. Another question for you from Jack Krapansky. Is Ukraine focusing too much on symbolic attacks, for example, oil drilling platforms, Kerch Bridge, drones in Russia, rather than core frontline and rear areas?
It may seem like this from the very far from Ukraine, but that's, and thank you very much for that question, by the way, because they're not symbolic, they're very practical, and that's what we would love to know, to the international community to know. Kerch Bridge is a single point of supplying the Crimea with weapons from mainland Russia, and Crimea is used as the staging ground for creating and generating the forces, creating the groups, and then sending them to the front lines. So it has a massive logistical importance, and that's why we would seriously challenge the premise that this is just symbolic. And same thing with the oil rigs. Well, they're actually gas rigs, but and actually they're quite old, and they were used over the 10 years of since they were captured in 2014. They were used as a military object. So there was equipment there were radars there, and so on. We already addressed that back in a time when we got back Zmyny Island, but Russians kept coming there, and that's why it was very critical. If you look at the map where they're located and then connected to Zmyny Island and then connected to Crimea, you would have a line which basically blocks completely the northern Black Sea coast. So their location is very strategic, and combined. So Russians, what they wanted to give Crimea, obviously the most western part, then these rigs, and then there's Zmyny Island, and then have equipment there and forces there, and basically that would completely block us off the close us off to the northern part of the Black Sea. That's why unblocking that is very important operation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. This ties to another question. Greg Tillman brings up something, just thinking of Crimea, we've heard that listed as a red line. So Ambassador Herbst, to you, the question, what role do Russian and NATO nuclear weapons play in this conflict?
At this point, of course, on the actual battlefield, they play no role whatsoever. But Putin has effectively used the bluster of possible nuclear escalation to deter the US and NATO from sending Ukraine all the things it needs to win this war as quickly as possible. Numerous times, the administration has said, sometimes at high levels, we cannot send ATACMS to Ukraine. We cannot send MiG-29s to Ukraine back a year and a half ago. We cannot send F-16s to Ukraine because Moscow might escalate and they might use nukes. So Putin has put into our heads the nuclear threat as a reason not to pursue our interests boldly and as quickly as possible. And that's been a triumph for Putin, and frankly, a very weak performance by Western actors. We've lived in a nuclear age where we've had a nuclear foe, meaning the Soviet Union, going back over 70 years. There's a long-established nuclear doctrine, which Deborah knows better than I do. There's long-standing nuclear practice. And when we had serious crises with the Soviet Union, which was a more dangerous enemy to us than Putin's Russia is today, over Berlin in 1961, Cuba in 1962, we always considered the possibility of nuclear escalation, but we never spoke publicly about it as something that prevented us from doing what we needed to do. If Jack Kennedy had thought in that way, we would never have put the quarantine around Cuba, which was effective in removing Russian missiles and nukes from Cuba. And that was a more dangerous situation than the one we face today. So this is a problem, but it's also a problem whose solution is self-evident. Putin and his minions have threatened possible nuclear escalation over the entry of Finland and Sweden into NATO, and of course Finland's in, we're the nukes. They threaten nuclear escalation if Ukraine were to attack Crimea. Well, the Ukrainians have successfully attacked the Kerch Bridge, ships in Sevastopol Harbor, other installations in Crimea, and we're the nukes. So Russia has repeatedly indicated it might use nukes. They've always been a little bit cautious, but not saying they definitely would. Their supposed red lines were crossed, and somehow they didn't use them. And they didn't use them for a very good reason, because that would be, it would not work on the battlefield. Tactical nukes are not going to change the advantages Ukrainian forces have already demonstrated. And they don't want to use more than tactical nukes, because that would be suicide. So as bluster, it has slowed us down, but it has never been implemented. And the chances of them actually using nukes are not zero, but they're very slight.
Deborah, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just say that it bears repeating that the last time I looked, the US was the world's greatest nuclear power. And there are also 2 other nuclear powers in NATO. And sometimes, instead of running away from the Russian threats, it doesn't hurt to pick up the phone and go, oh, by the way, just in case you forgot, we're bigger than you. We have better nukes than you. Let's stop this conversation. And we've not done that. We've sort of shied away from reminding the world that for whatever political reasons that we're not a great nuclear power, but we are. And when you are a great nuclear power and when you have the most efficient military on the face of the planet, you don't have to say that. You just have to smile when Putin says what he says. And, oh, by the way, have you looked at us lately? And that should be enough to have a deterrent against Putin. We somehow have decided that we're not going to behave that way. But multiple administrations over the past multiple decades have used that You neither confirm nor deny. You just say, have you looked at us lately? You know what capacity and what capabilities we have. And that usually ends the conversation. For some reason, we've been shy about saying that, but we ought to say it.
The Biden administration, for a brief period, about a year ago, took that position, and it lasted all of about 6 or 8 weeks. And since then, we've had numerous times where senior administration officials have again brought up nukes as a reason for our caution or even timidity, and that's a mistake.
Speaking of caution, we've got an anonymous question I'll pitch to you, Ambassador Herbst. At Vilnius, NATO pointedly decided not to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance. What impact might that decision or a decision next year to invite Ukraine to join have on the war? Is the lack of invitation a signal to Russia that the West is not committed to Ukraine's victory?
I was in Vilnius as an observer, and my sense is that general timidity that I just referred to is also behind the very, very weak communique at the Vilnius NATO summit. And sadly, the principal authors of that weak communique were the United States and Germany. Many East European nations, and some Nordic nations, even the French, even the British and even the French wanted a stronger statement. And I think, once again, that timidity related to the Putin's nuclear bluster played a role in it. A lot of people were disappointed in Vilnius, believing that only encourages Putin to think that he can outlast that timid West. And I'm sorry to say, there's some rationale to that logic. That's all the more reason why at the Washington NATO summit next year, we need to take a strong step towards Ukraine's membership in NATO.
Thank you very much. Deborah, Mr. Mercer, anything to add to that?
Well, certainly there's been a whole discussion about Ukrainian participation in NATO as something which is unacceptable to many politicians currently, and because they consider risks too high and so on. But at the same time, there's been a constant confirmations that Ukraine's future is in NATO. And frankly speaking, there is like a complete lack of connection between one and the other. I mean, if Ukraine's future is in NATO, how is it going to happen if nobody wants to make any step forward? We think that Ukraine can contribute to the global stability as a country who actually has currently keeps all the weight of fighting the Russians in Eastern Europe. And we would be a great partner. But yes, it is up to the West to finalize with us the plan. We have to start working on this like pretty much right away, because the next summit is is going to be quite symbolic. And the last thing we need to do is to keep this until the last moment, and then and then guess what's going to happen. So we welcome all analytical community to participate in deciding how the next year summit should be.
Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, does the Eurasia Center have any plans to contribute to this analysis?
We are working on a project as to what we'd like to see at the Washington NATO summit. I am reluctant to say anything more about it, but this will be coming to an event near you sometime early next month.
So keep an eye out for Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center work on this. Okay, another question. Ambassador Herbst, you spoke about this a bit earlier, but from Peter, are you satisfied with the effect of the sanctions against Russia, having in mind that there are more, not less tanks leaving Russian companies, less drones being provided to the Russian forces? And if not, how could sanctions setup be improved to be more effective?
I believe that the overall macroeconomic sanctions have dealt a real blow to the Russian economy, not a blow which has led them to end their aggression in Ukraine, and not a blow that has shut down the Russian economy, but it has cost the Russian economy several percentage GDP growth a year. I believe that those who claim that the sanctions have not been very successful cite, for example, IMF figures suggesting the Russian economy will grow at a rate of 2 or 3% this year. Those figures are likely wrong. Now, I'm not an economist, although I'm not illiterate in economics. But the IMF bases its data on statistics provided by the Russian government. And the Russian government has no reason to provide honest statistics. There's an excellent professor of management at Yale, Jeff Sonnenfeld, who's written extensively on this, and I commend all of our viewers to pay attention. That's the issue of macroeconomic sanctions. Well, actually, there's one more point about macroeconomic sanctions. The Russians have gotten around this partly by the use of nations willing to, in effect, violate sanctions and trying to do it secretly. Turkey, actually not just nations, Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe some Central Asian states. And so the talking about secondary sanctions on those who are violating sanctions is one way to crack down, and maybe we need to look at this. The other element, though, it concerns the Russian arms industry, and I already mentioned this. We have pretty effective export controls, which have made it much harder for Russia to get components for its weapons, but they have succeeded in getting some, and there are steps we must take to tighten that. And there are no reservations, I believe, in doing that. No one can claim that they are being taken advantage of if they're sanctioned for helping Russia get chips that are necessary for their drones or other weapons that are raining death and destruction on Ukraine.
Thank you. I've got a question I think I'll leave more as a food for thought for future discussions. This is from Ian Kavanagh. He says, is there any initiative in Ukraine to tell the story of Ukraine's military history pre-2014? At a recent conference, I talked with a senior French commentator, a bright, well-educated person who nevertheless was utterly convinced that Russia could never be defeated by Ukraine. I think such assumptions result partially from a lack of knowledge of Russian defeats at the hands of Ukrainian or Polish-Ukrainian forces in the past, or indeed Ukraine's role in the Red Army in World War II. For future consideration. Well, we are at time. Last words from anyone? Any main takeaways you want people to have? We'll go quickly to you, Ambassador Herbst.
Quickly, relating to the last question, there are a lot of international affairs experts, a lot of experts on Russia, who think that therefore they know Ukraine, and they obviously don't. We saw that in the U.S. intelligence community, which brilliantly portrayed before the big invasion what Russia would do, and dismally portrayed what Ukraine would do. All they do is consult with us Ukraine experts, and they would have gotten a much better sense as to what happened, what would happen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister, last words.
Yes, I would address the fact that some people think that Russia cannot be defeated. They've been defeated all the way through during this war, over and over again, despite their, perceived massive capabilities. They cannot achieve pretty much anything right now. And the whole discussion right now is at which speed we're taking back our territory. And some people criticize Ukraine that not that it's not happening, but it's happening too slow to some opinion. But think about this for a second. So there's no argument and there's no discussion that Russia is doing okay. So they're not doing okay in any of the operational directions which we discussed in the very beginning. And right now the question is how quickly and how far they will go and how far they will retreat this year. So obviously they can lose and they will lose. And right now, as you see, we're pushing in all directions. What you see in the Black Sea is just the beginning. Yes, the victory is absolutely imminent and it's coming.
Excellent. Thank you. Deborah, last words, 30 seconds.
Last words are, I think, watch this space, because not only is this going to have implications for Russia's view of a superpower as itself in Europe, but this is going to have implications for Russia as a Far East power as well. The way they've been bleeding both personnel and weapon systems and their inability to keep up with this should affect the long-term viability of Russia as seeing itself as a huge Pacific power. And no one should fool themselves that this entente with China between the two of them is anything but a brief blip on the legend of history. That's all it is.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for your time. Thank you to everyone for joining us. As Deborah said, watch this space and watch it with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We'll be back for more discussions, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you all.
Bye.